start this morning with a session entitled Heading Off Harm, Pathways, Potency and Policy. It's a great alliteration. And so there's a slight change of cast in that Anne Lingford-Hughes is going to do PowerPoint karaoke to John Holmes's slides because unfortunately, as I think you heard yesterday, John isn't very well. He's got a tummy bug, so he wasn't able to make it. So we shall be judging Anne on performance in terms of style. Anyway, so this first session is an interesting one, particularly in the light of some of the developments in Europe and internationally in the field of harm reduction in tobacco, where tobacco has kind of, certainly illicit drugs, the concept of harm reduction, it's taken a while to get to take hold, and in some countries it still hasn't, but for a lot of the community, the public health and academic community, it has taken hold. In tobacco, it's still much more controversial, and it's been made more controversial just recently by, obviously, the introduction of electronic cigarettes, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that from Anne McNeill. So, anyway, we're looking forward to an interesting session. We'll start with Anne, and hopefully all the slides will work as planned. So it's 15 minutes, and then 10 minutes question and answer, and then we'll have a chance for a general discussion at the end.
Press on the microphone, okay. Sorry, we couldn't be here yesterday. I had a clinic in the morning, which I had to cover for somebody else. As you've already heard, John Holmes is unwell, so I'm giving his talk. He very kindly let me have his slides and some notes to go with them. But there are other members of this work area in the audience, and I welcome them to chip in during the discussion. It was a great pleasure to be asked to be part of this work area, and I myself learnt a lot, and some of the themes of that will come out as I go through the talk. So what were we tasked with doing? Well, we were tasked to identify factors or determinants for the development of substance use and gambling-related harm. And the first thing I would say is that after a year's discussion, we did agree with determinants, but it is in brackets, because we were aware that actually within the different disciplines, there was a different view about the definition of determinant. And I would say that it is in there, but it is not used in a sort of causative way that a lot of people might think it is, but there are factors that are involved. This just illustrates one of the challenges we had, which I'll allude to again, about actually the language that are used in different disciplines. So our objective was discipline specific, and I'll describe which disciplines were involved shortly. And our aim was really to develop a synthesis. So the idea was that each of us with expertise in some particular area would review the literature, and then we would come together as a consensus to determine an overall sort of synthesis of the evidence of harm. And from that, we would then be able to derive implications for policy, practice, but also further research. We needed some sort of structure in order to review the evidence and also have those outputs. And there was actually quite a debate about what kind of structure this should be, but we eventually, again after some time, looked at these determinants across changes in behaviour. So we did think about life course, but the evidence probably didn't fit that, and also we felt that it probably may not be sufficient. So we wanted now to look at transitions, because we also thought that might be very important in terms of the public health and policy and research implications. So we looked at transitions really from sort of no or very low risk use to risky use. So what was our definition of risky? Again, quite a lot of debate. We came up with a definition that was a risk of doing harm. And that was left to each individual area and discipline to somehow to define what they were meaning, and then at our synthesis meetings we would make sure that we were reasonably on the same page with this. But it wasn't just to the individual, it was also to society and wider public health. So it wasn't just to the individual, which you see in many reviews would be talking about the risk for that one individual. We then had another transition through to harmful use. Now, again, as a medic, so I'm a psychiatrist, harmful use is an ICD, is our international classification definition. A harmful use means you must be doing some physical or mental harm. This was a much broader definition, so it would include addiction, it would include dependence, being an alcoholic, whatever, but it was the actual harm was being caused, and again, not only to the individual, but to the wider society. And so it embraced a very large number of harms, probably the very, very broad category, more than you might see in some. The final transition, which was thought to be very important, because as a treatment, working in the treatment services, I'm aware that actually most people reduce their harmful use without any formal intervention or treatment intervention. So we wanted to look at how that might be happening in terms of going back to no, or being abstinent or at least low risk. So all the treatment studies were formally excluded from that. These were the disciplines that were involved. So we had public policy, economics, sociology, anthropology, psychology, neurobiology, genetics, and sort of also history. And I'll come back to these, but we then clustered the dimensions of the outputs in these levels, and I'll come back to that. These were the range of disciplines. So as you can see, very, very broad. And I suspect there are very few instances where this range of disciplines will get around the table to discuss things at length. And they were often very lively meetings, I would say. Robin Room's smiling here. They were lively. There was quite a lot of discussion. I would say mostly actually about definitions and then interpretations. In addition, we had somebody who had some expertise in cross-cultural studies. Since this was a European grant, we were very interested in looking across the different cultures. But again, that was often quite challenging. And gambling was there as well. So most of us, I work both in gambling treatment services as well as substance misuse, but there were particular areas where we also needed some expertise around gambling. But otherwise, they were more discipline-specific. And clearly, there was some overlap. I mean, I work in the field of neuroscience, and clearly there was a lot of overlap between psychology and neurobiology, but also with genetics, which sort of added the ability to really rigorously was really, how does this explain? Why does, for this psychology, why is there a transition? What might be some of the factors involved? And it was the face-to-face meetings where the iterations started to happen, where we would prioritise some areas and reduce other areas in terms of their level of importance to try and get some synthesis, to try and get some commonality. And a lot of that was about language, about definitions. There were then a couple of some science writers who helped pull these together. They sent them out for review and back in, and these were refined over many months. A lengthy process and quite arduous at times. So how did we come up with a model? So this was the model we ended up, and this is just the risky use model, and this is only for alcohol, so alcohol's here. I would say that we went through about 3 or 4 different models, trying to work out how to display the information as simply as we could to get the message across. And again, at a meeting with all of us there, we agreed on this. Apologies, some of the colours aren't coming out too well with the wording. What we felt was important was to try and group onto 3 different levels. So what you see here is kind of the social and the environmental, and then at the individual level, and then sort of getting down into the more cellular, molecular levels. And within each of those levels, you would then see clustering with marketing and availability, social norms and customs, social control, the power and social status, and environment of use. And again, those clusters were agreed at the meetings. And then when we started to look at the determinants or the factors that were coming out from each of the reviews, we then would place them where they were supposed to, where they best fit. And again, that was often quite a lengthy discussion, iterative process. The same thing happened at the level of the individual and then at the cellular and molecular level. There were some things that would come out at multiple levels. Stress was one of them, impulsivity, and others that were very clearly to do with availability or marketing that would just be at the social environmental level. You can see lots of different examples being given for alcohol, and this probably is the most populated slide. If I change that to something like ketamine, GHB, or one of the club drugs, the novel psychoactive substances, it would be very blank by comparison. Opioid would be somewhere in the middle, as would gambling. So some of them were very sparse in what we were able to put in due to a lack of evidence. The other thing I would say is that what you can't see here is which way it would go. So some of the social stuff might predict increased likelihood of risky behaviour, and some reduced, obviously, within the devil's in the detail, and that became in the narrative of the reports. So out of these, what kinds of conclusions did we come to? Well, it was challenging, but likelihood of risky behaviour regarding that drug. And again, that was quite hard to put into the model. So these were really to give a sort of an accessible overview, but enjoyable, I would say. But it is very crucial because for me, I mean, I do not generally sit in a room with economists, sociologists, anthropologists. So it was very interesting for me to hear particularly their view and how things, I would conceptualise things maybe in terms of brain's chemicals, but they would conceptualize in terms of behaviour or interactions or policy, etc. And that was actually what drew me into taking part in this. It was very interesting. But it also meant that in order to actually inform policy, I think we do need a comprehensive sort of overview. And John's just given an example here of one of the challenges which I've already talked about is some of the approaches within each discipline may be counterintuitive for other disciplines, and we need to overcome a lot of those barriers. I mean, social science is there, but I mean, I think it was actually all of the disciplines that were involved. In terms of the determinants, I've already said it's not meant to be causative, but they were there associative, and they were likely some of them will be determinants, but not all of them. And again, when we went through the different models, I've just shown you one for risky use, but it appeared that at the level of the social and the economic, that political environment, the top level, appeared more important in the transition to risky substance. By that, what we mean is those boxes were very populated, particularly for some drugs, but actually the majority of them, whereas the lower levels, in terms of the individual and the cellular and molecular, were blank. Now, a lot of that may be due to absence of evidence rather than evidence that it clearly is not involved. And that is obviously one of the challenges. When you went to harmful or into the sort of the cessation part, I mean, inevitably I study most people who would be in treatment services, this sort of the tip of the iceberg, some people call it, in terms of addiction. And we tend to spend more, I rarely study people who are transitioning to risky use. And therefore the evidence at the higher, or the lower levels at least, the sort of the more individual and the brain levels, molecular levels were more populated. So we have a slight imbalance there, and they appear to be more dominant. But again, we need to work that, take that with a caveat that it may be absence of evidence. What we felt that actually by doing it the transition way, it did help us with giving some pointers towards policy, because it can help identify stage-specific rather than a sort of global, that actually it may be the same thing that is a determinant at each level of transition. And again, the feeling was that we hoped that by studying some of the transition that we would get a more nuanced public health response to the development of the problem behaviour. I mean, that was really the aim in this. Being affordable, but going to a harmful use, but depression and anxiety, so you start to get more mental health problems. But again, that may be due to the population being studied. And for many, actually, when we were looking at the transition to low or risky use or cessation, actually social change in terms of marriage, partnership, children, those things were markers for actually lots of drug use stopping and also gambling. So we did find common determinants, but there is a little bit of, I was saying to somebody earlier, that impulsivity seems to be the flavour of the month at the moment, and therefore, you know, a lot of people are studying impulsivity. And it may be, again, that bias that things are popular and therefore people are focusing on them to the detriment of other things. In my field, you know, we don't look at opioid enough. I think it's a major problem, but we look at alcohol. And the other thing I've already said is that actually the majority of people that are engaging in some sort of use of drugs or gambling actually transition to non-problematic use without any formal treatment. And the user's life just seemed to think, but I mean, I'm a bit concerned that our government seems to think giving everybody a job means they won't be an addict, but I'm not sure it's as crude as that. So very finally, in terms of what this was promoting, I think one of the things was really the interplay. So we were unable to look at the interplay. So a lot of my between different substances at different times at different stages of life, the data available does not do that. There is very, very little evidence about we should in a public policy framework, and very rarely does all of this get considered. We should be addressing specifically to max, I guess, it often seems. And it may be that different things are differently important. And again, we just very strongly believe the sort of the life course, and particularly with the ageing population, we really have very little evidence about how to support and help many of these people who will be developing problems later in life. And I think that's the last slide. Yes, it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Masterful. So we have time for some questions. Can I ask one? Am I allowed to ask one? I don't know if you're allowed to ask one. So the framework that's been built up seems very suited to, I think, alcohol and illicit drugs. It doesn't seem very well suited to tobacco. Was that
no,
do you think it is, or it just?
So nicotine was initially out completely.
Yeah.
And then it came in a little bit like we excluded it at the beginning. We decided not to include it.
Okay, right.
So that's why nicotine's not
fine.
being mentioned.
That's all right.
But the marketing bit, definitely towards the end of the iteration, the synthesis meeting, there were discussions about, because obviously tobacco gives us lots of good examples about the marketing bit. Yeah.
Because I think, because the framework probably, that sort of to risky use to harmful use doesn't really work with tobacco.
I mean, Robin, is that your thing, that we did exclude nicotine at the beginning, didn't we? And then it sort of crept in a bit.
Yeah. Oh, that's fine. You can have a go later. Yeah.
What was the level of sort of like longitudinal evidence? Like in the U.S., we have these national studies, and they've looked at longitudinal patterns. And one interesting finding was that antisocial personality disorder, if you looked at people over time, there was this maturing out phenomenon. And it's very interesting. And I just wondered if, there's transitions, if it's the level of data is such that you could sort of like track it over time. Yeah.
I mean, I agree there's lots of cohorts, but they don't have sufficient drug and alcohol data in them to really develop. So I agree with you, things like personality variables, depression, anxiety, all of those things we can look at and make inferences about how that might impact. But, nicotine gets counted, alcohol, but then you get down, cannabis sort of is there, but any of the other drugs, they're just not there to enable to inform you enough. And the other thing is some of the cohorts are, a lot of the social changes around drug and alcohol use, or drug use particularly, the novels aren't in these cohorts. So again, it's an absence of evidence, really.
Robin, do you want to just pass it back?
I mean, as one of the participants, one of the interesting things for me was that we made up this with great pain and suffering among ourselves around this model that you were just presenting around the 3 transitions that we were looking at. We probably didn't pay enough attention to the idea of how much did they map onto anything that was going to be in the literature. And they were interesting ways of defining it. They fitted quite well into the Alice Rapp notion of redefining addiction and so forth. But when it came down to it, often the literature doesn't answer those questions. You know, and in particular the surprise to me was that the move from risky to harmful was the weakest in the literature, in the sense that you've got lots and lots of studies of what are the characteristics of people who have harmful use, but not of that transition from being simply a risky user to being a harmful user. You know, what happens between, you know, using a little bit heavily and actually, you know, getting in trouble in one way or another, you know, and that was a real, so we were essentially unintentionally illuminating the weaknesses in the literature, it seems to me, in a lot of what we were doing. And a lot of what we were doing, relevant to what you were asking, it seemed to me was that we couldn't get beyond the pairwise relationship between some kind of predictor and some kind of outcome. That it was very difficult to go, maybe be now lack, but I think it was also the literature's lack. It was very difficult to go beyond that in terms of chains of causation.
I mean, one thing I would say is that, you know, we were all there as experts of our disciplines, and we all had to make quite, at times, I would say, uncomfortable judgments that this is how we were going to take the literature and interpret to fit the question. But as Robin said, actually, it was a tough thing. But that's part of the challenge of what we had set ourselves.
Thank you. It's a reflection of where next. I mean, we face the difficulty that you've put an enormous investment collectively in this area into first of all learning to work together, and secondly coming up with this model. But of course, in a way, you've just started. What you need now is another 5 years to really unpack all of this. And I suppose it's a sense of frustration that we all feel in Alice Rapp, that, you know, there is no obvious, easy structural mechanism to continue something that has started. I mean, I don't know whether the group itself, you've had any reflections of, you know, can you continue together? Can you find a way to take this further forward?
I don't think we've explicitly had that, whether we'll continue to work on this. I think, I mean, part of the reason I went into it was to learn how other approaches, but so no, we haven't. I think also, for me as a researcher, it's really, unless the funding streams change, so I have put in multidisciplinary grants, but because they then get sent to the 3 different disciplines, each of them attacks, and nobody wants to fund the whole thing. And I think, so my number one thing was, unless you are allowed to do that kind of, you know, calls that specifically want the multidisciplinary, then it's going to be harder and harder. That would be the first thing. And secondly, there are a lack of clinicians often, and I appreciate I'm a clinician here, so that the messiness of the real world isn't often allowed in the lab, if you see what I mean, or at least in, you know, cohorts. You're not, you know, you need the bigger numbers for the smaller numbers using substances compared to the general population, and those are big, large studies, but those are the investments that are needed. Virginia.
I just wanted to ask you about the history that you were using, the historical perspectives, because you mentioned that, but I didn't see much evidence of it in what you presented. So I wondered how you managed to integrate that, because we were asked yesterday how our work integrated into the overall picture.
I'm just trying to think, Robin, I can't... in terms of the history, you're asking a good question, but I'm completely blank, I'm afraid.
I didn't think I was ever going to be asking you a question about history.
No, I welcome questions, but I can't remember. It was a lot of it was more about the anthropology side and the changes in...
I mean, there was certainly a historical
there was,
presence there in the sociology and anthropology, but there wasn't much real straightforward
history. Yeah,
we're going to have to move.
Okay. We did think and quote you often, though.
No.
Yeah. One more question. Have you got the mic? Yeah.
I would like to follow up a little bit about what we learned overall for Alice Rapp from that. We learned a lot about ourselves. We learned a lot about side issues, etc., and that we all want more money for the next 5 years. Forget it. What is the bottom line, which you would say comes out as the two biggest contributions to current thinking and current knowledge of that, content-wise?
In 30 seconds.
From just our area or the...
Yes.
The biggest thing. Oh, that's a horrible question. One is, I think you do need multidisciplinary. We need to be understanding what we're each talking about.
Content.
I know, but to me, that is the fundamental. Okay, there's no content. Well, I think there is content in that, because I think you've got to understand the language in terms of. I think in terms of honing me down to what do I think, or I just don't think we're there. I don't think there's enough. I think the lack of evidence in a lot of these areas would be unsafe to make any absolute, this is the key message coming out of it, sadly.
But knowing what we don't know,
is important, Don Rumsfeld said.
I accept that.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so now we're going to move on, and Anne McNeill is going to talk about less potent delivery systems.
Yeah. Thanks very much, and hello everybody. I'm sorry mine is a bit of a fleeting visit, arriving in the middle of the night, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this part of the debate. So yes, so my focus is on electronic cigarettes, and I'm just going to check I've got this the right way up. There we go. I won't go through the summary. I'd rather spend time on the presentation. Okay, so I just want to make sure, first of all, that we're all on the same page and understand what an electronic cigarette is. Basically, it is a solution, usually of nicotine, dissolved in propylene glycol or glycerol. And when the user takes a drag, that activates a sensor which heats that solution, producing an aerosol, which is then taken down and inhaled by the user. The aerosol is usually referred to as a vapor, and the people who use electronic cigarettes are called vapeurs. And they have evolved over the years since they were first developed in 2003. So they were first disposable, then they were rechargeable with cartridges, and then they've developed into these tank models, as we refer to them, which are filled with a liquid. So I hope everybody now understands what electronic cigarettes are. Now, in tobacco control research, Robert West is actually my father, because he was my PhD supervisor. I know he doesn't look like my father. He was just very precocious as an academic. But my grandfather is Mike Russell, who headed our department where we work, so he's Robert's father. And Michael was very prescient. He was talking about the need to separate nicotine from the smoke in the 1970s. He identified that the reason most people smoke is because of the nicotine, and the vast majority of deaths are due to other constituents in tobacco smoke. So there's the nicotine coming out, and there's some of these other constituents. And that's exactly what Hon Lee did when he invented the electronic cigarette in 2003. He was a smoker, his father a lifetime smoker, and he wanted to produce a tobacco-free nicotine delivery device that would save him from a life of tobacco addiction and death from cigarettes. Unfortunately, his father has now died. So how exactly, what are the relative risks between smoking and electronic cigarettes? So here on the left-hand side, I've listed from Cancer Research UK what we know about what's in cigarettes and what comes out of them. So there are over 5,000 different chemicals in cigarette smoke, one of which is nicotine. But over 70 of the chemicals are known to cause cancer. And then there's hundreds of thousands of other chemicals which are known toxins. On the other side, electronic cigarettes, those constituents are largely absent. And the few that are there at doses way below the level that they're found in cigarette smoke. And those main chemicals, propylene glycol, glycerol, are not associated with any serious risk. So on that basis, some of us have come up with a figure of a 95% reduction in relative risk, and I'm going to come back to that figure later on. So what we can now talk about is a continuum of harm for nicotine products. So at the left-hand side, they're very dangerous. Those that are lit and burned, equivalent to the dirty syringe, if you like. And what we want people to do is quit their nicotine use. But if they can't quit, then we want them to move down the continuum. I put pipes there because if you haven't smoked cigarettes, then you tend to inhale the pipe smoke into the mouth. If you've already inhaled, then you transfer that inhalation, so they're equally dangerous. But at the other end are the nicotine replacement therapies and electronic cigarettes. But there are also other products. So chewing tobacco is very prevalent in South Asia and in South Asian diaspora. And there's also a product called snus, which those of you from Sweden we're very familiar with, which is a more regulated, low nitrosamine smokeless tobacco product. And I'm going to say a few words about that in a minute. But so far I've just been talking about individual risks. And people raise concerns about what happens at the population level. And these are concerns that you've already been talking about. So whether they would attract new users to nicotine and then on to tobacco use, so the so-called gateway theory, that smokers could switch or reduce rather than stop smoking completely, so concerns about dual use, and then whether ex-smokers could take up the products and then relapse to smoking. So these are concerns. What we need to do is look at the evidence base. Lynn Kozlowski in 2001 produced a thoughtful paper about the risk-use equilibrium, so that if you have a product which is, say, 95% less harmful, then you'd have to multiply the proportion of users in the population 20 times to get an equal risk. Now, if you've got, like in the UK, we have 1 in 5 of the population who smoke, it's impossible to multiply that proportion 20 times. So even if everybody in the UK took up an electronic cigarette and no one smoked, now let me just be clear, I'm not advocating that, but even if everyone did, you would still be much better off in public health terms. The other concern which is raised, which I think is behind a lot of the issues, is the involvement of the tobacco industry. I mentioned that this Chinese entrepreneur started electronic cigarettes, but since then the multinational tobacco companies have got involved. And I've worked in the field 30 years, and you do develop a strong antipathy towards the tobacco industry when you go through their materials showing how they have lied and misled over the years, particularly about nicotine. But I want to come back to snus because snus gives us proof of principle that a harm reduction approach to tobacco can work. So in Sweden, there's a long tradition of using snus, and whereas the overall tobacco use is about the same, the harms are much lower. And so it's a demonstration that people can use other sources of nicotine and population harm is reduced. So this is just one example of respiratory cancers, but you can repeat this for many of the other illnesses related to smoking, including oral cancers, where it's about 5th from the bottom. So that's just an example that it can work. So just going back to the nicotine harm continuum, people say, yes, but aren't you concerned that more people would be potentially using nicotine, or that people are continuing to use nicotine in society? So, well, yes, I mean, ideally we would like everyone to stop using nicotine in the same way that we'd like everybody to stop using caffeine and other drugs. But for me, this isn't about new users taking up nicotine. We're very much focusing on those people who are using nicotine in its most deadly form. But we do need to consider nicotine dependence as we talk about these issues, because you'll often hear that nicotine is, a very highly addictive substance. Well, it is when it's delivered in cigarette smoke. It's the speed with which it reaches the brain, and it's also the fact that cigarettes are highly engineered products to maximize and optimize the addiction. It's not the same when we're talking about nicotine replacement therapy, for example, the patch. So one of the reasons we think e-cigarettes, just looking at the graph in the top right-hand corner, are popular might be to do with the dose and the speed of delivery. It's still much, much slower than cigarettes, but the blue line are the first generation e-cigarettes, and the red line there are some of the later models, and they're becoming more sophisticated in terms of how they deliver nicotine. So you can see a higher graph there, but as I say, still much lower than nicotine. But there may be other reasons why e-cigarettes have taken off in a way that nicotine replacement products never did. So some of the marketing, which is familiar and looks like some of the old tobacco advertising. Some of those adverts in the middle are a bit more sophisticated, where they're trying to show how cigarettes are evolving into electronic cigarettes. Don't let your friends smoke. But there are also probably behavioural and packaging issues which explain their popularity. But given they're so much less harmful than cigarettes, why aren't they even more popular? And so we started to look at what perceptions people had about their relative risks, and this work was led by Leonie Brose in our group. And in this national sample, we found that the right answer is the left-hand side, they're less harmful. But what we've seen over the last 3 years is an increasing proportion who are saying that they were equally harmful. And this has been seen in other surveys. So this is another national survey, similar pattern. And then we're also seeing the same pattern among youth. So we need to stop and reflect, well, why is this happening? And I think there may be two main reasons. One is the portrayal of e-cigarettes in the media, where the focus is always on the harms. So e-cigarettes exploding, causing cancer, etc., etc. But also our failure to distinguish nicotine from tobacco and talk about these products and talk about the nicotine harm continuum separately. So I want to just finish with a couple of personal thoughts. We collected all the evidence together in a report which was commissioned by a government body in England, Public Health England, in the middle of last year. We appraised about 189 different articles and published what we thought was quite a thoughtful appraisal of both the individual risks and the population risks. Well, a week later, this was completely slated in an editorial in the Lancet. And I won't read you the quote I've pulled out, but I think perhaps the thing to note is the comment about all the more perilous by the declared conflicts of interest surrounding its funding. And what they did is they conflated. They were picking up on the 95%, and we explained why we felt it was important to communicate a figure, because if you just talk about less harmful, people don't get it. But they focused in on a paper led by David Nutt, and they implied that there were some conflicts of interest there, and they conflated that with our report. And this was picked up, if I can get this to move on, a couple of weeks later in the British Medical Journal, so the second leading journal, by Professors Martin McKee and Simon Capewell, who critiqued our work. And what's interesting is that both those individuals were connected with the Lancet editorial. A piece in The Guardian referred to Simon Capewell as an author of the Lancet editorial, and he tweeted that. But then that was retracted later and the tweet was taken down. And then in a Freedom of Information request, Martin McKee was linked to, he alluded to writing the editorial. Whatever the facts, it was rather shocking and disappointing that both the leading medical journals immediately came out very quickly. I mean, if anyone's tried to publish in the BMJ, a 4-week turnaround to get something through is pretty impressive. It got worse. We had a piece in November where Public Health England were referred to as the Pied Piper. And there was a lovely infographic, I think they called it, which you should look at. It's got flashing lights and it links the tobacco industry to various people in the field, including Robert and myself, not directly, but indirectly. In fact, Robert and I aren't connected, which shows they didn't do their homework because they don't know he's my dad. But anyway. So I'm just going to put one piece up very quickly, which shows how this accusation of conflicts of interest spread around. So this is from CBC News in Canada, and I'm grateful to Amelia for providing this. So this was a debate, and you can see that somebody pointed out that the study was funded, our study was funded by tobacco companies. So of course Public Health England didn't like that and challenged it. So they then came back and said, okay, PHE has told CBC News that this statement is incorrect and that PHE commissioned the study. It's still unclear how that study was funded. Well, commissioned usually means funded. But PHE went back again, and this time they said PHE commissioned and paid for the study. An article in the British Medical Journal suggests the sponsors of the PHE study were funded by tobacco companies. So it's very, very hard when something gets published in a leading medical journal to actually say that that's just blatantly untrue and inaccurate. Perhaps legal action will follow. So my thoughts on the future, finally, are rather pessimistic. It's a very complex area. It's made difficult by vested interests and set positions. I haven't got time to go into regulations, which are coming in May through the EU TPD. I hope that they will reassure smokers about the relative risks, and I hope that they're the right ones to optimise public health, but we have to wait and see. But what we really should be relying on is the evidence base. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anne. So, questions. I shall take Alison first.
Thank you very much, Anne. Yesterday we heard about margins of exposure and the risks associated with nicotine as compared to the other substances in tobacco. I don't think Dirk's still with us, but Jürgen might be able to comment. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with their analysis, which demonstrates that nicotine is one of the most harmful substances. And I think Dirk alluded to the fact that tobacco companies haven't actually included nicotine as the actual chemical compound in their analyses of dangerousness. I was gobsmacked when I saw that stuff about nicotine because I'd assumed that nicotine wasn't the harmful element in tobacco smoking, but the research presented yesterday would suggest otherwise. Can you comment?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't here yesterday, so apologies for that. I'm familiar with the margins of exposure. Nicotine is a toxic substance, but there's been an interesting a couple of papers, because it used to be said that if you had a drop of nicotine on the skin, you'd die. And so people have looked back into what the evidence is for that, and it's not very sound. And the estimate now of how much nicotine you'd have to kill you is a much greater amount. But I would still contend that the vast majority of the deaths are caused by the other constituents of smoke. There are concerns about nicotine in pregnancy, but nevertheless, in England we still would recommend nicotine replacement therapy being used rather than nothing, because otherwise they're going to continue to smoke. So I think there's a misunderstanding about the toxicity of nicotine that needs to be clarified.
There is, and I made the point yesterday that acute toxicology is one thing and epidemiology is another. And Sweden has a population of people with very high levels of nicotine exposure, and the only evidence that there is of any increase in risk of cancer is of pancreatic cancer. And remember, this is smokeless tobacco, this isn't pure nicotine, so we don't know what the constituent is. And that evidence is, that the risk is not, it's not clear to what extent that's attributable. So, the idea that, nicotine is extremely toxic, but not in the doses that people are using it. And so I think this is a bit of an issue around the area. So just to fill in on what the discussion was yesterday, I think it was, yes, at the front, then Jürgen, and then...
The cigarette companies for years got the idea that nicotine, or put out the idea that cigarettes don't cause cancer because the studies they're not randomized trials. They're all associations, and association doesn't proves causality. The electronic cigarettes look like they're a lot more expensive to make than just regular cigarettes. The profit margin for making regular cigarettes must be humongous. And I'm just curious if you have any inclination that the questions that are being raised about the safety of electronic cigarettes, that the hand of the tobacco industry is in that. It has to do with economic. They'll make a lot more money with regular cigarettes than they will selling electronic cigarettes.
That's a good question, and I don't know whether the tobacco industry are behind some of these accusations. I'm trying to think if I've seen anything concerning them. I mean, the tobacco industry are now entering the market, and the concern is that they're focusing on the disposable end of the chain, which may be the less effective ones. So it'd be good if we could try to influence the tobacco industry in the direction in which they go. And it's ironic that in the UK, the only electronic cigarette that's gone through the medicinal route is a British American tobacco product, but it is at that end of the spectrum.
Yeah. I mean, it smells like the same kind of thing that happened with epidemiological studies.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've done it before. And I'm conscious there's actually quite a lot of questions, and so we may keep some of them till the more general discussion, but you can...
I'm an author of one of those margin of exposure studies, a co-author. Basically, I want to come back to those evidence bases, etc. I believe that if we take all of the studies which are the basis for the benchmark in the margin of exposure, we would still see a higher overall. I mean, you can't metanize them because they're different endpoints, as you say. You know, part is toxicology, part is epidemiology. We come up with a methodology to halfway combine the two in things. But the main need out of the debate, the take-home message should be that we really need better basis studies which feed into those models before we can make a definite conclusion about the MOE of nicotine. And that's very much in line with what IARC has said, that they're going to reopen the evidence gathering, and they make a consensus meeting on nicotine and cancer, because that is still missing.
I mean, I think that's for a much longer debate than we have the time for here. But I would just remind you that, you know, during the course of this conference for 2 days, just in the UK alone, 500 people will have died, will die as a result of cigarette smoking. So I think it's really important that while those debates are going on, we do try to communicate what is known at the moment about the relative risks of the products.
I can take two more, and then we're going to go to the next talk, and then we'll have a bit of chance for the general discussion right now.
Very nice talk. I was wondering, in the animal literature, there's some evidence that the combination of nicotine and acetaldehyde is especially addictive, especially for adolescent rats, the work of Beluzzi and others. So I was wondering, to what extent in e-cigarettes there's also acetaldehyde?
You might be alluding to the study that was published, I think, earlier last year, where there was a study which showed that acetaldehyde was produced when electronic cigarettes were ranked up to a very high level of heating. What subsequently came out was that nobody would use the electronic cigarette at that temperature because it creates something called a dry puff. So it just wouldn't be used. So I think whilst there was a concern in that particular case, it was shown to be not appropriate. And this is why it's really important, I think, to involve the users of these products as well in some of the research that's going on to make sure that they're doing realistic experiments about them.
Yeah.
I'm normally modest, but I was asked to stand up so the camera could see me. I think this is a really important paper, Anne, and it's the other side of the coin. Last night we had a discussion about the influence of multinational companies on policy, and as soon as you think there's a red under nearly every bed, then you assume there's a red under every bed. And I think one of the issues is that the British Medical Journal and the Lancet have both become almost campaigning. They're looking for issues to expose. And I think you should go and see the editor of the BMJ, Fiona Godley, and sit down and show her this stuff. And then I think she might be prepared to publish your alternative view.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, we have tried to get meetings, and we have had a few discussions with them which are ongoing. So perhaps I should be a bit more optimistic about the future. Let's see. But thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne, for a stimulating talk and discussion. And the third talk is Patricia Conrod, who's going to talk about promoting resilience in young people's lives. Thanks, Patricia.
Okay, I'm here representing some of the work from Area 6, focusing on young people. For Alice Rapp, we had a number of projects, but what I'd like to do today is just kind of frame my talk around a couple of questions that I was asked in a recent interview with the CBC. So back, referring back again to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, as Canada is contemplating legalizing marijuana, what we're getting is a whole bunch of questions from the public and the media, particularly, as you can see from these questions, concerns about young people. And so I'm not going to try to answer all those questions, but today's talk will involve some of the work that we have done in Area 6 around young people's concerns, and this concern in the public around whether adolescents are more susceptible to the influences of substances, and then what kind of policies should we recommend based on the evidence to date. So this is a widely accepted kind of neurobiologic theory or heuristic model of addiction. And what you see here is that the way addiction is understood from a neurobiologic perspective is that substances of abuse hijack three very essential brain functions or brain circuits. The first two being very involved in classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and the third being involved in a system that is involved in kind of perseverative behaviors, compulsive and perseverative functions of the brain. And that this theory also kind of stages addiction and understands different brain circuits as being involved in different stages of addiction, where as people begin to start using what is understood is that the circuits involved in classical conditioning and operant conditioning are supraphysiologically stimulated, and that is then what causes these very hardwired, highly reinforced associations and behavioral reinforcement. And then what happens is that as individuals start to withdraw from substances, you have the stress and the threat circuits of the brain being influenced. And finally, as substance use becomes highly frequent and excessive, you're also influencing more frontal circuits that are involved in preoccupation and compulsive or perseverative type of functions. So in our area, one of the major criticisms of some of the dominant theories of addiction is that they might explain how someone gets to this final state of addiction. They might explain a little bit about what's going on in the brain when someone is repeatedly self-administering at very high levels. But what they don't explain is how it is that you go from being a non-using, somewhat kind of normal or non-using young person to this end state. They don't take into account individual differences, and they don't take into account the developmental process, and most importantly, this key period where the brain is developing. So there are some dominant theories of adolescent development. So this is an article that was published showing how neuroscience has actually informed decisions in the United States around personal responsibility for a criminal act by an adolescent. And the theories and some of the neurodevelopmental literature support this idea that over time, the brain these brain circuits that I just mentioned kind of develop at different rates. And what you have is that kind of more ventrally, kind of the striatum and more subcortical regions of the brain involved in reward processing, operant conditioning, approach behaviors, they tend to develop earlier in adolescence, right here. Okay, whereas the more higher level frontally mediated cognitive control mechanisms of the brain develop at a slower rate and over a longer developmental period and end up kind of maxing out at about 23 years of age. And so what ends up, what we now call this is a developmental lag, where it might explain why young people and adolescents tend to take on riskier behaviors and tend to demonstrate more impulsive and sensation-seeking behaviors, because you have this developmental lag. Now, other people, including myself and I think many people in our area, would suggest that this is actually, developmentally adaptive and functional. Having this lag allows young people to kind of break free from being dependent on other people and for decision making, and is somewhat motivating them to explore, to do autonomous decision making, to carve out a path for themselves that's more appropriate for them and their current environment for this next generation. So this is really important when it comes to understanding the development of addiction. And so in a review that is just about to come out in press, we, and as part of the work of Alice Rapp, we considered this developmental process and its implication in addiction. And we also reviewed all of the literature that looked at the extent to which early onset substance use is influencing this developmental process, and then also how it is that pre-existing neurodevelopmental factors are interacting with the adolescent developmental process with and without alcohol and drug exposure. So I think I mentioned this. It's really important to study the addiction from a neurodevelopmental perspective while also considering individual difference factors, because time and time again, what you find in the few longitudinal studies that are examining the effects of substances on the developing brain is that they're showing that the most robust predictors are pre-morbid factors, even at a neurocognitive level. And so we kind of categorize the different individual difference factors that have been shown to be prospectively linked to risk for early onset substance use in adolescents. There are clearly environmental factors associated with this accessibility, but also just social norms. So at the friends level, family level, school level, country level, if you exist in a larger, heavier using context, you're more likely to use, and that accounts for about 10% of your behavior. But there are also very robust individual difference factors, personality, temperament, mental health. You know, these things can be measured at 3 years of age, at 18 months of age, and they have been shown to prospectively predict risk for substance misuse, gender, education, employment, and age of onset. So the age of onset findings are really important here because they're extremely robust predictors of who transitions into heavier and more problematic use. And so this is really what is driving this question. Is it adolescent exposure to substances that's somehow setting the brain up for addiction? And this is what we investigate. It's also worth mentioning that there's clearly a strong heritable component. There are a few studies looking at the genetic question from family studies, from molecular genetic studies, and the evidence is looking like these influences are mediated through these variables here and possibly these. So they all kind of overlap. Here is a heuristic model that we've presented in the past. We updated it in the work that we've done with Alice Rapp, where we're essentially showing how genetic and early life factors such as childhood neglect and trauma and other heritability factors actually are mediated by but can also moderate the different kind of neurodevelopmental trajectories that can either be described at a neurocognitive level or a neurophysiologic level, but are also very well described in personality scale. So human beings have developed an ability to describe some neurocognitive profiles that are highly predictive of future problems with respect to substance use and mental health problems. And that these different trajectories appear to be linked to different patterns of comorbidity, different reasons for using substances, as well as the likelihood to develop problems with different types of substances. So one really clear example is, for example, sensation seeking has been very well studied and appears to be associated with this sensitivity to reward, but not just natural rewards, but also rewards like pharmacological reward and sensitivity to the psychostimulant properties of substances of abuse. And these young people would describe using substances as a way to experience enhancement. That's the only reason they use, and then they tend to use substances in that way. It predicts binge drinking, for example, and early onset use. So that's the heuristic model that came out of this review. The other thing that came out of this review was the recognition that young people go into adolescence with these premorbid neurodevelopmental predispositions. And then it's the adolescent developmental period as well as early onset substance use that is then going to further influence someone's delay or vulnerability. And there is some evidence that using then it might exacerbate or could even reverse some of these neurodevelopmental characteristics. But in terms of the evidence available so far for nicotine, alcohol, and cannabis, there isn't a huge amount of support that it's the drug itself that's driving a lot of the neurocognitive deficits that you see in alcoholics or in early onset drinkers. There's a gradient of effect, and these abnormalities can be observed before the substance use has had its onset. Or at least it informs the trajectory through life and in interaction with substances of abuse. There's a lot of other information here, but I don't have time to get into it. And clearly, this is important because there are intervention and policy recommendations. The recommendations are selective intervention. We know a lot now about who is more at risk for misusing substances. And these can be measured reliably before young people start using, and interventions, for example, some of the work I do, but there's also a ton of school-based interventions targeting, for example, impulsivity, temperaments, antisocial aggressive temperaments in children as young as 5 years of age that have been shown to be effective in reducing the risk for future drug and alcohol problems like 10 years later. So there's a lot of work that can be done around selective prevention. We also talk about some of the concerns that policymakers and the public might have about selective prevention, but actually if you go and you look at the literature, there's very little evidence that when selective prevention programs are delivered, for example, in schools and communities, that the recipients of these programs actually feel stigmatized. So the concern at the policy level is that this is stigmatizing and we shouldn't be doing this. If you actually go and do the study, and there are very few studies, very few people feel stigmatized, and that's because there are all kinds of examples where schools and communities target interventions for other reasons. There's also the case for universal prevention. So it's extremely important that we're just reducing the base rate of the behavior so that when young people, particularly young people, enter into the adolescent period, start making choices, autonomous choices, that substance use isn't the dominant behavior and choice for them. And obviously indicated interventions or preventions being important in order to reduce the frequency and the quantity at which people are stimulating these vulnerable systems, and then obviously treatment. So I have just like 1 minute, I think, to just quickly refer to some of the work that will be coming out of our area. We don't have time to present this work, and it's also in a very preliminary stage, but we had been commissioned to look at when culture and biology meet. So one of the other major conclusions from this review was that we understand the role of individual risk factors. We're beginning, and the literature is very scarce, but we're beginning to understand how these individual difference factors interact with exposure to substances. What we don't understand is how they interact with each other. And so very much like the conclusions that Anne gave us earlier today, it's extremely important that we start to understand, how, for example, how environmental context interacts with a genetic factor, or how a certain selective prevention program might interact with another vulnerability factor. And so there are a couple of projects within Alice Rapp where we're beginning to look at, for example, how much a young person is primed by their environment, so how much they take on the social norms of their culture, and it could be measured at the country level or at the school level, and then how, for example, genetic factors might interact with these. So one piece of work was taking an ongoing, another European Commission funded project, the Imogen study, which is the largest genetic functional neuroimaging study in the world, and we added more kind of cultural measures to this cohort for Alice Rapp, and are beginning to try to understand cultural differences. So this study involved 8 different sites across Europe and 5 different countries, I think. And basically the bottom line is that we're looking at a paradigm where we're testing the extent to which young people naturally approach so the extent to which they're kind of drawn to alcohol cues. There's individual differences around this, but there also could be country level differences, and that would be compared to non-alcohol cues, as you can see here. And we have, our group have previously shown that heavy drinkers have this kind of natural draw towards alcohol cues, and that could be explained by developmental models. And there's also been some work showing the relationship between some genetic markers for how the opiate system works. And so in this study, we wanted to examine, really prior to the onset of severe substance-related behavior, would genetic factors in some way predict substance use, and would it do that through this kind of natural tendency towards reward cues or towards alcohol cues? And to our surprise, again, this is similar to some of our other findings, it wasn't drinker status that predicted how much you were drawn to alcohol cues. It was a premorbid factor, and in this case, it was the OPRM1 gene, and this is a gene related to very much implicated in how the opiate system mediates psychostimulant reward from alcohol. So that's just one example of the findings. The other one final study that's coming out of this group is an online addiction cognitive bias assessment platform. We've now collected data from 20,000 young people online, again testing cross-cultural differences and the extent to which young people are kind of developing habitual approach biases towards alcohol and drug cues, and then to what extent do these interact with personality, predict substance use, and also cross drug boundaries. So if you are drawn to alcohol, does that have any implication for your cannabis use, and so on? So I'm actually going to stop here and just kind of open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to general discussion. So, who'd like to start? Yes.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your speaks. Very, very interesting. I have a question about the predisposing factors, because I think that it's really something interesting and new. And my question is about can they predict also other kind of addictive behaviors, and also other kind of deviant behaviors, and for example, behaviors, violent behaviors, etc., etc.
Yeah, a lot of the work that I did through the Imogen study examined this question, and it's quite clear that substance use kind of clusters with a number of other externalizing behaviors. Much of the variance in substance use behavior in young people overlaps with variance in kind of misbehaving generally. And when you kind of model it that way and conceptualize it that way, you end up with a couple of endophenotypes or neurocognitive factors that cross diagnostic boundaries. And so we really are starting to think about things in more dimensional terms. It has allowed us to identify neural as well as cognitive and personality factors that can differentiate between different clusters of symptoms.
And particularly for the OPRM1 gene, we found it to be related to alcohol, but actually also to other appetitive stimuli. And some people have also linked it to risk for obesity, for example. So if you have this G allele, it's probably you have an innate, relatively strong appetitive response, and then your history determines to what exact categories you will develop that. But it is a strong appetitive response.
Hi. Sorry, I was supposed to stand up. As a person who has been studying cultural differences between young people from different alcohol cultures in Europe, with the help of focus groups where the youngsters would discuss how they perceive alcohol commercials and alcohol beverages. I'm just thinking out loud now. I feel it's fascinating to see that you are somehow, if I understood you correctly, you are now measuring the cultural differences in their relationship to the product by measuring their cognitive reaction, how they are drawn. Also, I can see that you are also a little bit orienting towards connecting it somehow to brain functions. This is not critique, I'm just speaking out loud what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that at least when we were speaking with youngsters from different countries and they were discussing in groups, one great result that we had from that was that actually they are very critical to what they see. Even though you can be drawn to something, you could still be above it intellectually and understand that you're being. So I'm thinking that how do you deal with these kind of extra dimensions that might not show in your material?
Well, I mean, we don't have time to get into all of the results of the study, particularly the online study involving 20,000 young people and how many countries? 8? 7 or 8 countries. And there are clearly cultural differences. What's interesting, is that they all report kind of negative expectancies from substances, and those are predictive of who goes on to drink, okay? But there are also other kind of cognitive processes at play. And over and above understanding the negative consequences of substances and expecting negative effects of substances, the young people who go on to drink have very specific motives for drinking or for using cannabis. And they're related to these kind of neurocognitive profiles, enhancement. Okay, they're using, and it's the ones who report drinking to enhance and drinking to cope who not only go on to drink, but it's highly predictive of whether they're going to start to develop problems. So, to refer to this debate about, frequent use over time or heavy use over time, in the young people data, you'll see is that we actually are able to differentiate between the drivers of drinking and the drivers of problematic drinking. And what's driving problematic drinking in this sample is drinking for risky reasons, to self-medicate, either for enhancement purposes or for negative reinforcement reasons. And your personality determines, your personality will determine which motive you'll use cannabis or alcohol for.
But that's also culturally. So there are differences also between the countries. With some of the countries showing the enhancement motives and some countries showing the negative reinforcement motives. And this is very fresh data, but one particularly interesting thing was also that identity. So to the extent that young people identify either with cannabis or alcohol across all countries, southern, northern, had a strong relationship with developing problems. So that is really something new, I would say, that could even have maybe policy implications.
So these models take a long time to develop, and it's going to involve multi-level modeling at the country level and at the individual level and over time. And so that's what we'll be able to do in one model eventually, but this is going to take a year, I think, to model.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. And now, can I invite Anne and Anne back up? Oh, stay, because we're going to have a general discussion. Do you want to sit down? And is that how we'll do it? I can't remember how we did it last time. Yeah. It's like a press conference. Right. Now, I want to give a chance to people who haven't had a chance to speak yet. So, first of all, in the front here, and then at the back, and then Peter.
Hi, I think we have a wonderful opportunity here of combining the first presentation with the last one, because in the last one we didn't mention the determinants of transitions from risky behavior to non-risky behavior. And I think we can try to mix in the future the methodology that you share and develop with the one with young people, and try to see the differences between the two, and not just analyzing young people or adolescents as separate, and trying to reach a continuum between young people, youngsters and adults, and trying to find the way through. Because at the end, I think that most of the behaviors that we have as adults, they started as youngsters, and trying to make a division between the two without learning how to move through this continuum, and having this opportunity of mixing your methodologies, I think we have to move through that.
And when you had your model up, it was a huge overlap in terms of how you divided it up, very similar. But I think, and we'll probably go back and have a look at where are the bits. I think we had the other more broad level of disciplines input than you had, which enriched, I think, particularly the higher level, the environment and the context and stuff. But you keep coming back to this over time, and I think that's what we were. I think when we initially wanted to do ours was a life course to understand how things may change over time. The evidence just isn't there, as I said earlier, and I think that's the tricky bit. I think what comes out, you're more certain, I guess, because you were looking at younger people about this idea that it's not just the substance. It's a lot about the innate heritability or vulnerability or whatever that is, and the impact of that is clearly very different in a developing brain at one point. I don't think we cannot study the brain if you're talking about addiction. I think that's really it would be an odd, but I know many people do advocate that, but I think it would be odd. But I think that's the key that's very different with the younger people. You've got the pre-exposure, which most of the evidence doesn't really look at.
Well, hello, my name is Viktor Mravčík, I'm from Czech Republic. I have two comments or questions. The first concerns the first presentation. In your model, you showed basically two thresholds, yeah, from completely unproblematic use to risky, and then to harmful, and then back again, basically to. And I wonder how it fits to what we learned yesterday about heavy use over time, and about the fact that the use exists in continuum, and then it's hardly to find qualitative differences. And there was one comment also directly after your presentation, noting that there is lack of evidence for this path through this from this risky to harmful. Maybe this is due to the fact that simply it's about the quantity, about intensity of all the factors, and like combination of them, rather than about qualitative criteria. Anyway, and the second one is similar, and it's to the third presentation. In one of the slides you showed kind of development of problem in young people with this arrow, which is going bigger and bigger to the end. And on the bottom there were interventions, or block of interventions. There was a selective prevention, universal and indicative, yeah, prevention. And it was in an order which is unusual for me, yeah? Because this concept of universal selective indicative became part of the concept of prevention in Czech Republic, and we understand that in a way universal is the okay, before we have environmental strategies and what we can call pre-primary, but universal, then we have selective focusing on more vulnerable groups, and then indicated for the rather risky individuals. So it was surprising to me to see it in another order. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments.
You have to turn your one off.
It's on. Your first comment.
No, you have to turn yours off.
Your first comment was very astute, and what's fascinating is we even find in the in early stages of onset of substance use in young people, it is all the other factors that are predicting problem indicators. So it's personality psychopathology, risky reasons for use, which is predicting the variance in, let's say, an audit score or a Judith score. But those things don't predict quantity, frequency of drinking. So I think your observation is right on. It's just, that it's all the other kind of life problems and co-occurring factors with addiction that might actually be defining and predicting the variance in addiction measures, whereas quantity frequency is a more pure measure of the behavior itself. And then, yes, I have intentionally reversed the indicated and universal and selective interventions, and that's because it's very clear now that you can measure the factors that you should be targeting in selective programs before the onset of substance use. And if substance use is interacting with these trajectories, then we should be targeting them early. But in fact, we should be targeting these problems all the way through life, because there's no evidence that these premorbid factors go away, that there might be some evidence that some young people might grow out of impulsivity, but we all as clinicians know that trauma plays itself out in someone's life for generations and even cross generations, and so does impulsivity in terms of its impact on parenting behaviors, on teenage pregnancy, on crime, and so on.
Can I just follow up one comment about the whether it's the substance or whatever? I mean, after discussions, I don't think it's just about quantity frequency, and part of it is I'm very influenced by the pre-morbids, the those with family history positive, who have altered, dysregulated neural circuits that may be different. I think the Imogen study is showing some of those and the way it's developing. So I understand why people count how much people consume But I don't think that's the entire story, and I think we just need the interplay between that. I think the dysregulation leading to vulnerability is not, we don't understand it fully yet. And we don't understand, therefore, the impact of the substance and then how that alters over the lifespan, particularly as you go into your 60s, 70s, 80s now. I mean, that, those areas haven't been looked at all.
Well, I'm going to take two more, and then we'll go to the coffee break. But there's lots of opportunity in the coffee break and afterwards for the rest of the day to discuss some of these issues, which many of which are recurring as they would do out there. Ian first, and yeah.
I've extended my interest in vice recently by joining an independent body called the Responsible Gambling Strategy Board. And at one level, it's very frustrating.
So you're all over the top of the
newspapers. Yes, there's an oxymoron in there.
Yeah.
One level, it's very frustrating because I think there's so little research in gambling harm, and much of it is funded by the gambling industry. But at another level, I wonder about prevention and risk-taking in young people, because you can separate the risk-taking from substance use and mind-altering drugs. And I wonder to what extent you've been able to look at gambling as a kind of risk-taking in young people, and whether there are any messages from that.
We have not looked at gambling behavior, but the interventions that we did, the trials we did in the UK, and now there's one coming out of Australia, where we're targeting these pre-morbid factors and teaching young people how to manage them, from a neurocognitive perspective. They have been shown to reduce alcohol use, cannabis use. We're just looking at smoking behavior, and we have effects on smoking. They reduce risk for psychopathology, and they prevent the likelihood of someone transitioning into significant depression, anxiety, or conduct problem. So we do not have gambling data. It's just so low prevalence in 14 to 15-year-olds. You'd need a huge trial to demonstrate you can prevent it, but I would predict it would have an impact.
And the last question.
Yeah. First, related with the e-cigarette issue, I'm surprised that you are surprised about the reaction.
Yeah.
Because actually we know this from harm reduction in opiates, and still there are many places in the world where it's not accepted. We were discussing the other day, in our prisons, people are reconverting, having infections, and are dying, overdose, and still it's not possible to give shootings exchange, promote shootings exchange in as wide ways, no? So you shouldn't be surprised about that. The only thing is, in my opinion, maybe it has been seen as a product for everybody, and as you see in opiate harm reduction strategies, it's more for those with severe cases, those that other strategies are not working. Maybe in a way, the way of promoting this should be other ways, and not to general population as a strategy, as a first strategy. I'm just talking loud as a possibility. And from the other perspective, from the prevention, resilience about the other presentations, we talk about the problems, knowing a lot, much more about pathways and all the development problem, but I still don't see how to promote resilience. I mean, still, you talk about the problems, but I was waiting to see what can we do, because there actually is, I'm working on prevention, and when you see these, also the big determinants are influencing how to tackle this from a prevention perspective. I understand in the next session we'll talk about that, but maybe you can start.
Yeah, so in the next session, Fabrizio will talk about that, and also there is a chapter in the book that's coming out this spring that is much more focused on what are the strategies, so what's the current evidence base, and then putting those into context of these trajectories. So how can different intervention strategies harness resilience or be better targeted to these risk profiles and trajectories?
Anne, do you want to?
Yeah. Yes, I suppose for us in tobacco, wading into the harm reduction debate, perhaps we shouldn't have been so surprised. I was just surprised that the two leading medical journals did what I felt was rather superficial attack on the paper, just focusing on one or two aspects rather than some of the issues. I mean, to give one example, we talked about dual use of cigarettes and electronic cigarettes. Now, electronic cigarettes aren't a magic bullet, so you're going to expect some dual use. So what we said in our report is that we need to be strongly encouraging people who are using both to stop, and we suggested that they might want to go to our services to get help in stopping smoking completely. So we had very nuanced arguments which I just think were dismissed. In terms of your comment, if I've understood it properly, about the population approach, I mean, we're certainly not, wanting blanket marketing of these products nationally. But I think there is a debate to be had about how the products are promoted to smokers. You've seen the difficulties that we're facing in terms of people's understanding about relative risks. So I think there's a debate to be had about what types of marketing are appropriate and where that marketing should be. And there is a tension, because if you don't make these products as attractive or seem to compete with cigarettes, then smokers won't use them. So those sorts of issues, I think, do need to be debated. I mean, obviously, we don't want them to be marketed to children. But if a child is going to use a nicotine product, better that they use an electronic cigarette than smoking.
I think it's very interesting on the discussion on governance, that the fact that there is this major resistance, and I work for the public health department, so actually I know about this, and it's very interesting. But it's interesting in the context that there is a convention framework and a control, so weak control measures, and how this can produce so much resistances. But this is learning also from the governance, and this is maybe the major element here. This harm reduction comes later, too late, actually, too late. Comes in parallel with the control measures, and this provokes resistances. But all in drugs, we know how to deal with this. So in a way, it's trying to take the best from what the measures from control and harm reduction measures can bring. And it's not, I understand this is really the debate, and I think it's very interesting.
So we're eating into your coffee break, but we're keen to have a quick...
I just wanted to caution, though, is that these are harm reduction measures and that were designed to help smokers and users get off substances. And in both of these publications that I mentioned, I do refer to the risk of using them in adolescent populations, for example. And if a young person is going to take up smoking, are we really comfortable promoting e-cigarettes, considering the developmental sensitivity of the brain, the potential for sensitization? So there's a lot of neuroscience data on sensitization, particularly in the adolescent period, that we should be very careful about.
Yeah, we're not, just to be clear, we're not suggesting they be promoted to children. All I'm saying is that if a child is smoking, and there are many that are, then they would be better off using it.
And there you have it. So thank you very much indeed.